Blood satellite.
If I were Brian Johnson, I'd create a new venture and I'd do everything in my power to just shit all the time. Spend all my time in the washroom.
I'm injecting my son's blood because I want to shit and piss more.
My son has AIDS, by the way.
My son has AIDS. I forgot to mention my son is horribly diseased. That would be a great prank for the son to play on the dad. Like, I'm sorry, my blood's polluted.
Hey dad, did you take that blood? Did you like it? Yeah, why? Did you take the blood? Yeah, I took the blood. Why? What are you saying? I swapped it with sriracha sauce.
Sriracha sauce. And then he, again, being a billionaire doesn't make you smart. He's just a certified retard. It's like, so I'm gay now? No, it's sriracha sauce.
Yeah, it's
just not knowing what's going on.
He doesn't know what Vietnamese spicy sriracha sauce is.
I'm black now? I got an article here, and I'm going to try and sew this to the beginning of the last thing I want to talk about. And it's published in Discourse. It was published in 2022, but it's written by Martin Gurry. The article is titled "The Fifth Wave: Is the Medium Really the Message?" And this kind of piqued my interest because we were talking about Marshall McLuhan. We were doing a whole series on sort of the metaphysics of language and communication. And I just wanted to maybe go through this a little bit and just read it before we kind of dovetail into the next thing. He says, in a recent New York Times opinion piece, Ezra Klein shares a guilty secret. He says, I didn't want it to be true, but the medium really is the message. As a millennial and thus part of the first generation of digital natives, don't you hate that? I've been hearing that my whole life, digital natives. I had professors tell me that. It made me sick every time. Anyway, Klein tells us that he adored the new medium with its endless expanses of information. He adds, my life, my career, and my identity were digital constructs as much as they were physical ones. Of course, we all know where this is headed. Trump and Twitter happened. Christ. This felt like a sinister apotheosis, also known as a very bad thing. Inevitably, Klein fell out of love with the web. To his credit, and unlike most anti-technology, it says crotchets. I want to say crochets, but maybe that's something else. Crotchets. He looks for an explanation for this failed romance among media theorists who have a lot to say on the subject. And that's an interesting thing to think about. Like, we very rarely tap right into the liberal mind like this, but you have to understand how libs thought the internet was the shit. Libs thought the internet was the democratization of information. And you have to understand how much like Trump and us ruined that for them. Like, we made these people anti-internet. And I don't think we get enough credit for that, for chasing the libs off the internet. We did that with fucking Taylor Lorenz. You can't be a journalist now without standing under a fucking waterfall of shit. You're welcome. That's another thing millennials did for everyone, by the way. We made journalists scared to go out at night and during the day. Now, journalists used to be something that I used to bring up in family dinner. Now you lie and you say you're in new media. You're a journalist. Oh yeah, like fucking Rubenstein and Hammerschmidt.
They'd want to say now they're like a researcher or an influencer or something. But I think even 30 years ago, if you were with one of these publications, you could tell people at a party you were a journalist and they'd be impressed. That's an achievement. Not like it pays well, but like, wow, really? That's an important job. Now it's fucking embarrassing, which is wonderful.
If my son comes home and says, actually, I have a career, I'm a truth teller, I want to bisect him with a searing hot scimitar, you best believe. My son's not going to be a fucking journalist. Klein recalls a dramatic moment of recognition, hunger, That was the word that hooked me. That's how my brain felt to me too. Hungry, needy, itchy. But having confessed that his life, career, and identity were digital constructs, and that he felt not okay with it, this but superior to those who came before me, the itch to re-enter the construct shouldn't come as a surprise. Next up is Marshall McLuhan, famous today, as Klein reminds us, for his oracular judgment: the medium is the message. For the message of any medium or technology is the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces to human affairs. And for those who remember our coverage of McLuhan, this will sound very familiar. McLuhan was among the first to grasp that the structure of information is far more determinative than the content. Another effect of the digital medium is more indirect, but may also be more profound. The moment one enters the online environment, the self begins to liquefy. The lack of external or internal pressures make it impossible to maintain a definitive shape or character. On the web, you can become anyone or anything, a vertigo-inducing condition that is equivalent to being nothing. Identity, which in traditional culture was pressed hard upon us by social forces and in modernity became problematic, now dissipates into thin air. Those of us who are a certain age will borrow attributes from the analog world. Let's be clear, this is a pathological affliction. It's the cause of much anxiety, depression, even suicide. If we are in the grip of a vampirical hunger, an irresistible addiction to online buzz, then saying, let's take back our attention, begs the question of how. I think that question points directly at the future. We're not returning to the days of ink-stained editors and paperboys thudding a wad of newsprint on our front doors. What then? To paraphrase Andrew Murr, who is the McLuhan of our century, since we can't kill or fix the digital medium, we'll have to find a way to live with it. I thought he kind of touched on something interesting there, which is that if the medium is the message in the internet age is identities themselves, kind of what he's talking about with the dissolution of identity. I'm not even sure that's entirely true. I think it's true in the sense that a lot of like that, the anonymous culture of the internet was interesting in that sense, but I think people reinvented themselves online. I think the people who underwent like identity death were the people maybe too old or too, I don't know. Like maybe it's too old to do it. Like they felt like they were dying, whereas like millennials created a second self.
I forget the context, but we had talked about in a previous episode the idea that even if you think you have no identity or if you've lost it, you can always be defined in your relationship to people outside of you. So even if your identity is just that you're an outsider, that's still an identity. So a better way of describing it would just be that we had a rapid, like a cascading, unwilling change of identities en masse. But it's not like our identities were destroyed or something, like if anything, it's just a rapid changing of identities.
Yeah, it brings into sharp relief the idea of dissidence, which is a word that gets thrown around a lot around here. People will use it in different ways, but in creating secondary or tertiary identities often, and it's not like creating like a character that you play either. It's just understanding that you need to heighten certain, like you are making your personality into information. You are, as McLuhan said, you're extending your senses. As every technology or medium extends the senses, that could be touch, that could be sight, that could be speech or sound. I do think what made the internet distinct is that the sense being extended was the sense of self, whereas every other medium, including film and music, would have extended every other sense. In the information superhighway, we extended the sense of self, which we didn't know was a sense before. It kind of gave birth to our understanding of the sense in a meta sense. So our interactions and our engagement with the entire idea of identity itself has been extended in such a way that previous generations might not even been able to understand. And we're seeing this become more normalized with Zoomers and Gen A. What I guess we're calling them Gen Alpha now. I don't like it, but we'll do it. And that's why, like, our relationship with our own identities, we now stand outside of it. It's completely foreign to us, and that goes back to our coverage of Jim Hogan and Decadence. Like, we are a meta people. we almost can't exist in a genuine way anymore. So it's like, for some people maybe that feels like dissolution or dissolving, but I'm like, I think it's something else. I think it's when McLuhan talks about when a sense is extended, it almost has to be numbed. It has to be like anesthetized in a sense, where it becomes less. Just be like, it's almost like it's what you described as auto amputation. So it's like our relationship with our own identity is more powerful than ever before, but it feels numb. And that's, I think, very shocking, especially to older generations, when they feel like they're losing their mind when they're online because they have to live schizophrenically.
Yeah.
But, I do wonder how that kind of circles back and affects your own mind. That affects how you perceive yourself. And again, like you said, there's the only way out is through, I guess. And I hear a lot of people, they don't really go deep with McLuhan. They go deep. I don't think many people probe the depths of the medium is the message and, the real severe implications that means. That just means like, oh, you have to craft your message differently for different. I'm like, no. It means you talk about different things. It introduces new mindsets, new paradigms entirely. And so the entire idea of dissidence, it has necessarily changed. Like the idea of when we talk about the word dissidence, it's because we're online, and we're online because we're not over there in the real world. That seems like a different world that we don't even want to be a part of, in a sense. And if anything, we want to take what we got going on over here and imprint it onto the real world. But sort of that camaraderie we all feel, even if we don't agree on ideology, at least there's the camaraderie of we're in this. Like you had just said, you define yourself in opposition to the group. We all define ourselves in opposition to the mainstream to some degree, because maybe our ideas are too heterodox or nuanced or too old or whatever, but we're united in this space at the very least. And that to me is what dissidence means. It means just not the mainstream. And as we talked about before, right now the mainstream, especially the conservatives, they're trying to eyeball the next Gen Z that they're going to suck into their fucking machine of death. They're looking for young commentators, young men in suits to say, oh, come work for the Daily Wire, come work whatever, what the Steven Crowder network. They're looking for the hot young people who've got their finger on the pulse. But watch out for that. Now, I'm going to lead right into our next thing, which only really barely has to do with that. But we're going to make it work anyway. I read this book recently that is a sequel to the last book. Not a sequel by the same author, but a sequel in spirit. Last episode, we covered the Vax Unvax book by RFK Jr. And this book I'm looking at today is called Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills. And it's by Russell L. Baylock, MD. This is written by a neurosurgeon. And, that some people think, who cares? Well, I do, because there's a lot of claims made in this book, and I think it matters that this guy knows a bit about what he's talking about. Just like Thomas Zaz with the therapeutic state, it helps that he is such a renowned psychiatrist. Yeah. When he says psychiatry is fucking everything up. So the subtitle to this book, just to give people what we're talking about, subtitle is How Monosodium Glutamate, Aspartame, and Similar Substances Can Cause Harm to the Brain and Nervous System, and their relationship to neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, ALS, and others. So when we say The Taste That Kills, this was written in 1997. But The Taste That Kills, it's about how food additives are basically killing the neurons in your mind.
Now, what I have found out since I wrote this book, and this book was a very difficult thing to write. I went through a long period before I ever decided to do it, because I was warned by people who had dealt in this area before when I told them I wanted to write a book. One of the persons who first tried to start in this crusade, he said, well, that's fine, but let me warn you something. You're going to come under attack like you've never dreamed of. He said, Ralph Nader, most of you I assume know Ralph Nader, the consumer advocate. He became interested in this at one point, just one segment of it. He was so browbeaten and so destroyed by this industry, he said he would never touch it again.
And I'll read the first part here, just that kind of sets it up even bit better. He says, what if someone were to tell you that a chemical added to food could cause brain damage in your children, and this chemical could affect how your children's nervous systems formed during development, so in later years they may have learning or emotional difficulties? What if there is scientific evidence that these chemicals could damage a critical part of the brain known to control hormones, so that later in life your child might have endocrine problems? And finally, what if it could be demonstrated that all these types of chemicals, called excitotoxins, possibly aggravate or even precipitate many of the neurodegenerative brain diseases such as Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS, and Alzheimer's disease? He says several of these excitotoxins are man-made and used as research tools. Others are found in nature, such as glutamate, aspartame, and Crystine, Crystine, all of which are amino acids. MSG is a modified form of glutamic acid in which sodium is added to the molecule. That's all it is. So really, when I first picked up this book, I thought it was about MSG, monosodium glutamate. And you've heard about MSG, right? Haven't you?
Yeah, of course.
So my understanding was, and I think we talked about this before, I thought that MSG was just this great flavor enhancer, and the only reason it was taken off the market was because it caused headaches. And it was spun out by some weird newspaper editor, and it snowballed into this hysteria. And the story of MSG is actually kind of interesting. It covers in the book, but MSG, some people might be familiar with it, but MSG came from Japan, and it came from this substance called MSG, which was extracted from seaweed. And it was just a food additive, a natural food additive that the Japanese would add to their food just to make it taste better. Then they did what scientists always do, which said, let's extract the one part of the seaweed, let's turn it into a super form, and so we can add it to all types of food. And this is what happened when American troops came across Japanese rations during the war. They said, wow, their food tastes so fucking good. What are they doing? Rice shouldn't taste this good, right? So then it comes over to the West, and then it's synthesized and turned into this just a chemical they can add to anything to make it good. And it was used very, very widely. And the argument he's making in the book, and this is backed up by many studies, and he shows several brain scans, anything you could want in a book of science to prove what it's talking about. He's showing that what it really does is it destroys neurons in your brain. And the process by which it does that is very interesting. And that's kind of what I wanted to set it up as. And we kind of touched on this with the vaccine problem, which is that it's not a poison. Some people think something bad for you must be a poison. And if you take something bad for you, it will show up immediately. It'll make you sick. You'll have some immediate effects. The interesting thing about MSG is it is a natural substance. You can find it in nature. And that's where it was used for centuries, just in the form of ground up seaweed. But what happens is when you try and synthesize it and do what we always do, which is let's take the one thing we like, separate that, and make it 10 times more powerful. Because what's the problem with too much of a good thing? That's what we're here for, to take a good thing and make it great. The argument in the book is the process of doing that is what causes the problem. Because glutamate is found in the blood. It's found in your bloodstream. It's how your body passes proteins and everything, and it's found in the brain as well. And the argument he makes is that's what allows you to effectively overdose on it.
Now, this was originally discovered by Dr. Lucas and Newhouse, who were ophthalmology researchers. And they thought that glutamate would enhance the health of the retina because glutamate was a fuel for the brain and neurons. But what they found is when they fed this glutamate to mice, it destroyed all the retinal cells along the inner layer of the retina. 10 years later, Dr. John Olney, a neuroscientist, repeated this and found out that it also destroyed some very important areas of the brain. At that time, we didn't even know there was such a thing as a glutamate receptor in the brain. Glutamate was not known or accepted as a neurotransmitter. Since that time, we've discovered that, in fact, it is not only a neurotransmitter, but is the most common and one of the most important. 90% of all transmission in the cortex of the brain is by glutamate. 50% of all neurotransmission in the brain is by glutamate.
That your body kind of doesn't know, it knows how to process a poison, it knows how to identify a poison, it doesn't really know how to identify too much of a good thing. And our predisposition in the scientific world is to always overdose on good things. There's no such thing as overdosing on a good thing, right? But he's saying that could actually kill your brain. So he gets into the studies here. He says, in experimental animals, MSG babies are found to be short in stature, obese, and to have difficulty reproducing. More detailed studies found that these MSG babies have severe disorders involving several hormones, notably produced with the hypothalamus. Unfortunately, MSG is not the only taste-enhancing food additive known to cause damage to the nervous system. In fact, there's a whole class of chemicals that can produce very similar damage. They all share one important property. When neurons are exposed to these substances, they become very excited and fire their impulses very rapidly until they reach a state of extreme exhaustion. Several hours later, these neurons suddenly die, as if the cells were excited to death. As a result, neuroscientists have dubbed these class of chemicals excitotoxins. And really, if I don't get to this part, I'll say it now, that MSG is seen as a scary thing. You don't see MSG anymore. In fact, for a while, pretty much every Chinese food restaurant had to promote that they didn't use MSG. His argument is that, we don't use monosodium glutamate, but we essentially use glutamate in so many other food enhancers. So, look at the ingredients and he'll name a few of them here. Like they're essentially the same type of food enhancer that uses the exact same process, just by a different name. And this is most importantly the stuff that you give to your kids. This could be cereals. This could be not just processed foods. It could be used in a lot of different things. But if you're eating organic, it's probably less likely to have it there. But you can't be sure what they're using in restaurants. And as someone who worked in restaurants, man, you don't really know. They could be using high quality food, but is it all the sauces? Is it all the seasonings? Nah, they don't really check that. And a lot of them get them from the exact same suppliers. A lot of times there's not as much variety you would think back there in some of the sauces and seasonings and other ingredients you don't immediately think of. The fucking lamb is from an organic farm, but what's the marinade? So he kind of goes into it here. He says, often laymen look at the brain as if it were a static structure, an organ formed before birth that never really changes thereafter. But this isn't true. As simple as it might sound, the brain is a living, growing, and expanding organ. Over a lifetime, the nervous system is replaced biochemically hundreds of times. This means that every part of the brain, literally everything that makes up the nervous system, is constantly being replaced. This is why humans must eat to provide nutrients to replace these vital substances, including vitamins, minerals, and trace elements. Now, here's where it gets complicated. So the brain receives the same blood that flows through the body. Therefore, it's exposed to high concentrations of chemicals in the blood, both from metabolism and from your diet. Some of these chemicals are quite toxic to the brain. For example, glutamate can cause widespread destruction in certain brain cells in concentrations normally found in your diet. However, the barrier, we have a blood-brain barrier, though. We have this thing called a blood-brain barrier that can kind of sort through the chemicals that are allowed in. However, the barrier is not perfect. In fact, some parts of the brain never develop a barrier system at all. For example, the hypothalamus, the circumventricular organs, the pineal gland, and the small nucleus in the brainstem called the locus coeruleus are without barrier protection. Head injury, degenerative diseases, infections, and a multitude of other injuries can also cause this protective system to fail. It says it must also be appreciated that the brain at birth is still in the primitive stage of development. As a result, newborns and toddlers are at very high risk when exposed to food additives. The damage is slow and cumulative, with each dose of MSG or aspartate rather, damaging a number of important brain areas. And that's something I just wanted to draw attention to as well. Like the two most important findings he found was that you don't notice the neurons die until long after exposure. So you need to keep looking at them because they'll just seem to be excited and then exhausted, then they actually die. Similarly, all of these effects are cumulative. Now, a few neurons dying, you can deal with that. Neurons are constantly dying and being replaced. But over the course of a lifetime, eventually this takes its toll, just like smoking, just like anything. And you and I have speculated before, and this will sound pretty edgy, but we would say that like it seems that a lot of people who had Alzheimer's seem to have been bad people in one way or another. And some people say, but the counter to that, Alzheimer's, everyone can get Alzheimer's. It's random. But the more I look into it and the more I talk to people, none of this stuff is really random. Sure, you can maybe have a genetic predisposition to it, and they'll always say that, if nothing gets you, then cancer is going to get you eventually. But as we'll see in the next book that we cover, you can infect people with cancer. You can infect people with viruses that cause cancer. Similarly, if you're the type of person who eats shitty food and kind of abuses their body, maybe there is a higher likelihood that you'll have Alzheimer's. Maybe if you are like a careless person, treating their body like shit, and maybe treating other people like shit, maybe you actually do get ALS and Alzheimer's more likely than someone who takes care of themselves. And maybe someone who takes care of themselves is someone who takes care of others. This is all just speculation.
Yes,
but,
for sure.
But there is a connect. Basically, what he's saying is like it can't just be random. Maybe there is a connection between the foods you eat and these neurodegenerative diseases. So he gives an example here. He says, in the early 1950s, a neuroscientist by the name of Dr. Hayaski found that when MSG was injected into the gray matter of a dog's brain, the dog would fall down in his cage and begin to convulse wildly. Based on this observation, he concluded that glutamate was causing the dog's brain cells to become overexcited and fire uncontrollably. Previous experiments had shown that the brain used glutamate as a source of energy and to manufacture other molecules. It was therefore assumed that it was merely a brain fuel, which is a very scientific way of looking at it. Like, there's glutamate in the brain. Maybe if you just overdose on glutamate, you'll become smarter. This is something you would like boomers probably believed. And it's not the boomers' fault, because the scientists who were talking to boomers said it's like, just overdose on all the good stuff. And then you have a whole generation who just fucking did that. And now they're like losing their minds. Their brains are melting out of their ears and shit. And it says neuroscientists have discovered that glutamate is one of the most common neurotransmitters in the brain. Its role is primarily that of an excitatory substance. That is, it causes the brain to be stimulated in much the same way cocaine does. Using biochemical mapping techniques, we now know that many areas of the brain all contain an extensive network of glutamate-type neurons. What it means is that the excessive glutamate will not only kill the neurons with receptors, but also kill any neurons that happen to be connected to it. So he says, often MSG and related toxins are added to food in disguised forms. This is what I was talking about before. For example, among the food manufacturers' favorite disguises are, quote, hydrolyzed vegetable protein, natural flavorings, and spices. Each of these may contain from 12 to 40% MSG. Analysis of these taste-enhancing substances reveals some interesting findings. Not only does it contain 3 very powerful brain cell toxins, glutamate, aspartate, and acetic acid, but it also contains several known carcinogens. Incredibly, the FDA does not regulate the amount of carcinogens allowed in hydrolyzed vegetable protein or the amount of hydrolyzed vegetable protein allowed to be in any food products. So those are the names to look out for. And again, this is written in 97, so you can imagine if they've just found different names for things since then. It's funny that I was looking for juice to buy my son, Nichols. He's below the age of 1, so we're trying to get juice that isn't too loaded up with sugar or preservatives. And I thought I found one. It was from President's Choice, and it was like 100% no sugar added, 100% just juice. But then you look at the side, and there's only 2 ingredients, right? Water, but it says like orange juice concentrate, right? And if it was just orange juice, it'd just say oranges. But if you look at orange juice concentrate, there's a lot going on in that concentrate that they're not listing. So there's certain things that are bundled up in these kind of Weasley words, because there's juice where it just says, hey, all this is oranges and water. If this was just oranges and water, it would say that, but it doesn't. So I'm like, okay, well, what goes in the concentrate? It could be a few things, so you don't really know. I'm not saying that's what it was, but it's just like an annoying thing. This is the sort of game they play with food additives. And this is sort of how they operate. It says one spokesperson for the food and glutamate industries stated that even if MSG did indeed destroy the arcuate nucleus in the hypothalamus, it didn't matter because it was not known to have any functional significance in the brain. Yet it was well known at the time that the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus played a vital role, the regulation and release of important hormones in the pituitary. The committee continued to declare MSG safe as a food additive, even in baby foods. Dr. Olney states that it was at this point he began to look into the backgrounds of the members of the independent FDA committee and discovered it was funded by, and totally controlled by the food industry, and that most of the members of the subcommittee appointed to investigate it had financial ties to the glutamate or food industry. So basically they're bought and sold by these types of manufacturers. He says the animal closest to man in glutamate and aspartate sensitivity is actually the mouse. But even then, man is actually 5 times more sensitive to excitotoxins than the mouse. Humans accumulate glutamate in their bloodstreams following ingestion in much higher levels than do other animals. Together, these 2 factors, higher blood concentrations and longer duration of brain exposure, make humans much more sensitive to excitotoxin damage than even the animals on which they're testing. So we know that mice begin to develop brain damage when they are fed monosodium glutamate in a concentration 500 Gs per kilogram. So that's why they test on mouse, because they're the most sensitive. But even then, like, we are the most sensitive to these sorts of food enhancers. And he says, evidence began to appear for neurological diseases such as Alzheimer's, indicating that even though the symptoms do not appear until the later years, the pathological destruction of the neurons begins much earlier, even decades earlier. As we shall see later, the symptoms of Parkinson's disease do not manifest themselves until over 80 to 90% of the neurons involved in the involved nuclei, called the substantia nigra, have died. The neurons didn't all suddenly die at the same time. Rather, they slowly and silently deteriorated over many years. The same is true for Alzheimer's disease. This is why prevention is so important. And he makes a comment in the book. We associate aging with forgetfulness. We just assume that the mind and the brain matter naturally decays like the rest of the body. But if you actually eat healthy, it's not a given that your body will just be a train wreck by the time you're 80 years old.
Yeah, you'd think if it was a natural process, it would happen to everybody, but it doesn't. Alzheimer's and dementia is pretty selective, and it varies in intensity from person to person. So we can pretend, continue to pretend that it's random, or we can look for a cause.
Yeah. And so it's like, it doesn't stand to reason that you would just, your brain would just fucking die and your body would keep living, and now you're just this like brain dead person. And we just kind of accepted that as natural. It's been normalized in our culture. He has an interesting experiment here he talks about that I really highlighted. He says, as American troops invaded the islands of Guam following World War II, the military doctors were astounded to find that large numbers of the Chamorro Indians living on the Marinette Islands were dying of a mysterious disease that left the Indians too weak to stand or even swallow their food. Later, when other research doctors returned to the islands, they discovered that the mysterious disorder closely resembled another disease seen in the West called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. In 1954, epidemiologists studying the disease discovered that the natives frequently consumed large amounts of a particular plant called Cycas circinalis, or cycad, during the war years. Actually, this plant, made from the false sago palm, had been eaten by the natives for centuries. In fact, the Indians knew the plant was poisonous, and for that reason, they developed a ritual to render it safe for eating. When the scientists analyzed the seed, they found it contained various glynoside compounds, the most important of which was cycasin, a known liver toxin. It was also found to induce cancer in rats. Then in 1980, Dr. Garudo and his coworkers studied a group of immigrants from the high-risk area of Guam who had moved to the United States as young men and women. They found that even though these immigrants had been separated from the toxin for over 30 years, they still suffered a high incidence of ALS. Somehow, the toxin had a delayed effect. And that's really the other important part of this. It's the delayed effect that people kind of discount, that, you know, something that's bad for you doesn't just impact you right away. He says one of the prevailing theories of the cause of Alzheimer's disease is a chronic exposure to aluminum. The idea was given a boost when doctors observed a dementia-like illness in certain kidney dialysis patients. When these patients were studied, it was found that they had high levels of aluminum in their tissues. Later, it was discovered that the water used to dialyze these patients also contained high incidence of aluminum. Now, you have to wonder, is there aluminum found in vaccines? Is there aluminum found in other things you put in your body that you maybe don't want to? Because everyone will tell you there's no problem with putting aluminum in your body. Well, maybe there fucking is, right?
Yeah.
It says when scientists studied the soil of various regions where high incidences of neurologic diseases, they often found high levels of aluminum and low levels of magnesium and calcium in the soil of these places. It says there's evidence that if we live long enough, a much larger percentage of us will indeed develop neurodegenerative diseases. This is what I was talking about, the normalization. In a recent study of the incidence of Alzheimer's disease among the elderly, it was found that between the ages of 65 to 74, the incidence of disease was 3%. Between 75 and 84, it was 18%. After age 85, it was like 47%. The same may be true of ALS and Parkinson's disease. This steep rise in the incidence of these diseases could represent a combination of factors. An increased vulnerability of aging neurons, the natural attrition of aging neurons, and the accumulated action of years of excitotoxin exposure on weakened neurons. So it could be true that the neurons do weaken over time, but that makes them perhaps even more susceptible to these toxins. He says with excitotoxin food additives being virtually in every single manufactured food, our brain is constantly being assaulted by excitotoxins. During a lifetime, many of us also experience many periods of hypoglycemia. Children frequently develop hypoglycemia during illness because they usually lose their appetites. Much of the medications they take also lower food sugar. Adults, especially in today's fat-conscious society, are constantly on low-calorie diets and even starvation diets. Many of these diets call for foods low in carbohydrates, which may result in prolonged states of relative hypoglycemia. And that's why he's saying putting ourselves in this state of hypoglycemia also makes our brains more susceptible to excitotoxins, which is an interesting way of looking at that. You know, historically, maybe we never really went through these phases of starving ourselves on purpose while pumping ourselves full of different types of chemicals, you know, like cutting out bread and meat, but only taking weird new types of protein and injecting yourselves with things. So that might actually be killing your brain. And the reason he talks about this is he says chronic dementias account for almost 50% of nursing home admissions and cost $6 billion annually. This is in 97. You can only imagine what it is now. Demographic studies predict by the year 2030, the population of people over age 65 will have doubled. This will mean that an annual cost of caring for the demented could reach $30 billion by the year 2030. And that's $30 billion in 1997 dollars. That could be $1 trillion now based on inflation. And he sort of ends it here by saying, not only do humans concentrate glutamate to a much greater degree, but it remains at an elevated level in the blood for much longer periods of time, exposing the unprotected portions of the brain to very toxic levels. Glutamate accumulation in the brain appears to be a common denominator in several devastating conditions, and the list of neurological conditions either caused by or related to excitotoxin damage continues to grow. Therapeutic treatments directed at methods to reduce the damage have shown significant success in both experimental trials and clinical trials. And these experiments are typically with calcium and magnesium. Like there are ways around this. But I think, what do you think of all that? Because we haven't really spoken much. I wonder, what do you think of the premise?
Yeah, I mean, I believe it. I've read a little bit about some of this stuff. I wasn't aware of the MSG angle, but aspartame and a lot of the others. And I've kind of had a suspicion from something I had read a while back about microplastics. Not that there were specific problems, but that none of this has been studied anywhere near to the depth that would be necessary to consider it safe.
Yeah. Well, and once you explain it to what people are, it's like, oh, is this bad for me? Well, what do you mean bad for you? Like, oh, it'll make me sick. It's like, no, it's something that's found naturally in your body, and your body thinks it's good, and it makes your neurons too excited. And then years later, enough of this, it's like lung cancer. Lung cancer, there's a visual to it. Lung cancer, you can imagine your lungs getting black and you cough and everything. But I'm like, so just imagine that with, like, I think people now more than ever are into the narrative of chemical sweeteners and corn syrup and things like that, but there is no visual that's tied to it. I'm like, well, the visual is your brain turning black. I think maybe that's what you need to get people to really give a shit about this, because I still see aspartame, sweeteners like Splenda and shit when I'm in the cafe, and everyone knows they're bad for you, but no one could tell you why. It's a miracle sweetener, and you're like, okay, well, what's it gonna do? Kill me? It's like, well, yes, it will kill you. It will kill. It's killing like part of your brain. It's making you dumber. Maybe that's what you need to say to people. Like it's killing your brain power, or maybe that's not enough for a lot of people. I don't know, but to me, when you explain that, it's not one step. It's not take substance and makes you sick. It's actually a process of 4 or 5 different things, just like the vaccines. You have to explain what a blood-brain barrier is, but you have to say, like, no, this creeps in and fucks with you. But that's how everything bad happens. You know what I mean? With a cigarette, it's like inhale, kill lung. It's not a 4-step process that you need to explain to people. But maybe that's what we need. I don't know, because I think it's the accumulation of stuff like this that is killing people.
Yeah.
Like, how does plastic in your blood make sense to people? How does plastic get in your blood? Well, I mean, it's bottled water. It's Jesus Christ. My mother-in-law, I've had to stop taking food from her because she uses plastic takeout containers that she got fucking like 5-6 years ago to give us food. She's microwaved them to hell. You know what I mean? It's like, this stuff is seeping into your food.
We've been on this kick for a couple of years, just the idea of, like, as much as possible, source the food as raw materials from places we know, and make everything, most of what we eat and what we feed our kids is made in our kitchen with steel and glass. And it's part of it's about plastics, and part of it is about, like, you reading the labels, and you don't, it's not that I know what's in there or what it'll do, it's that I don't know what it'll do, so I'm not taking any chances. And it's this whole thing. It's like, oh, well, what is it going to do? Make you sick? No. Yeah, it's not going to make you sick. It's going to make you broken 40 years from now. And by the time you realize it, you'll just want to kill yourself because it's too late. So it's not worth it. Like, why take the risk? Why take the risk? Really? Like, what are you gaining by risking your health,
Yeah. And it's not the top of the, headlines as it should be. I think, like, this stuff is killing you, and they're lying about it because it's easier to make their slop more palatable to you. Because if they didn't put this fucking brain-rotting carcinogen in your food, you would say, wow, this tastes like peasant slop. I'm not eating this. Yeah. How dare you try and even think about trying to sell this to me?
This is like the butter margarine thing that I get into all the time. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that's in margarine that makes it taste more like butter. But at the end of the day, butter tastes better than margarine. It does. Real fucking butter is delicious. Like, especially good butter, because even the butter you get at the store has got shit in it, right? And butter is also better for you than margarine. So again, why do you keep buying the margarine? Margarine buyers out there, what the fuck are you doing? If it's price alone, okay. But we have to accept that most of this shit, it was never better for you. It never tasted better. It's just cheaper. It's like the transition from living in a freehold house to living in a fucking apartment. It wasn't actually good for you. It's good for somebody else who's making money on it.
The margarine thing baffles me because I think one of my grandmothers, the one who passed, might have had margarine at some point, but I'm like, it very clearly doesn't taste like butter. I don't think it's much cheaper, is it? Like, cheap butter is pretty fucking cheap, like no name
Yeah.
butter. And I know it's got stuff in it, but I'm like, why do you buy this?
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because the very cheapest butter is slightly more expensive than the very cheapest margarine. But most margarine that people buy is like name brand margarine that costs more than discount butter. Like, they would rather buy name brand margarine than like President's Choice butter. But the President's Choice butter is just fucking butter, man. It's milk fat. There's
honestly, and just to kind of cap this off, this is the life that we live with our young son Nichols. Everything, like you, we make it all at home. All of our food, we shop as organic as we can with the vegetables, and like we make everything. And it takes
libtard.
It makes everything harder. Like,
it
every fucking Thursday, my wife is up late doing food prep. And it's just like, vegetables, and it's making smoothies, and it's just really, and if people want to live that life, you can. People talk about it all the time. Like, I'm not going to feed my kids this. Okay. But get prepared for your life to be a bit more like hell. But it's worth it because that's the only way to do it. Like you'd said, like you look at the ingredients, you say, Jesus Christ, I've never looked at these ingredients before. Well, I guess we'll make it ourselves. We might as well. And it's doable. It's doable on a budget too. Just to let people know, it's just time.
Yeah, the time is the huge thing, and I think starting to make those sacrifices in your life, and then stepping back and saying, now hold on a second, are you telling me that even to reach a level of basic nutrition and health that our ancestors had without thinking of it, sucks up an enormous amount of my time? What kind of hellish existence is this? And it's like, yeah, that's what we've been trying to tell you. Like, when you're going out and you are coping and telling yourself that all of these things are for your benefit and that it's great that there's now a cheaper alternative, they're not helping you. They're saving $1 by fucking poisoning you, and you're going to die young and retarded. And again, this is true of nutrition, but it's true of education, it's true of infrastructure, it's true of housing, it's true of our culture, our media, it's true of this pattern has been attached to everything in the past 100 years since the war, essentially. So yeah, when you start doing stuff on your own and you realize how fucking sometimes expensive but always difficult and complicated it is to do things correctly, it's like, oh, okay, there it is. That's how they got all the cattle into the fucking pen. Is this way.
Let me just end with this one quote from the book that I think summarizes it even better. He says, many years ago, neuropathologists discovered strange-looking clumps of dark staining material scattered throughout the frontal and temporal lobes of individuals over 50. It soon became obvious that the presence of this unusual pigment was a normal consequence of aging, hence the name senile plaque. It appears that these plaques represent failed attempts by neurons to sprout new processes. This sprouting process also appears to be a very important repair mechanism in aging. Interestingly, the presence of neuritic plaques seemed to play no part in any loss of brain function. Many laymen believe that as we age, we're doomed to become mentally slow and decrepit. While it is known that the elderly do not do as well as the young on timed tests of mental ability, they'll perform as well as when given more time to complete the tests. And training, they will show incredible improvements in mental function, including cognition and memory. So that's just to say, like, it was historically not a given that you would just lose your mind as you went old. You become slower. Everyone becomes slower. You can't run, but it's still, the essence is still there, especially if you eat well and treat your body well. Everyone knows of seniors, like, how do they do it? How are they so spry and with it? And it's like, well, they probably ate better, and but there, I think there's a case to be made here that so much of this spite with the boomers, and again, not to blame the boomers, because what do they know? What did they do? They listened to scientists. They listened to doctors, and doctors led them down a path, just like they're leading us down a path now. Like, I can't blame boomers for this, and whether I blame our generation for going along with this COVID shit. right?
Yeah.
We got a lot of people who are just as fucking dumb as them. So let's not get on the boomer hate train just yet. But like, look at, was it always throughout history that everyone had Alzheimer's? I don't think so. It seems like it was discovered by this one guy not long ago.
Yeah.
And then it's just, and you read the paper, you read like there's an epidemic of this shit. Just like why is cancer rising? We don't know. We think it has something to do with your diet. Maybe you should exercise more. Well, for once, they might be right. But when they say a better diet, it means like finding these food manufacturers and burning people until like you're not being fed poison.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.